Straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily, we take a deep dive into the arrest of Bryan Kohberger, the man accused of ruthlessly stabbing 4 college students to death. Family members of those young victims are ready for his extradition back to Idaho.
I want him to be sick of seeing us and sick of knowing that these people won't let it go.
We're breaking down the science behind the investigation, as well as the impact the alleged killer's interest in criminology may have had on the crime scene.
We've taken leaps and bounds. We've jumped ahead in the recovery of evidence.
And what's next for the suspect?
I'm just as anxious, and the family is just as anxious to see the probable cause affidavit as everyone else is.
Law and Crime Daily, covering court cases from coast to coast.
Welcome, everybody, to Law and Crime Daily. I'm Jesse Weber. We're bringing you the very latest on the arrest of Bryan Kohberger, the 28-year-old grad student accused of mercilessly killing 4 University of Idaho students. The Washington State University doctoral student made his first court appearance on Tuesday, walking into the courthouse hours before his afternoon extradition hearing. Kohberger was arrested in Pennsylvania, thousands of miles away from the Idaho 4 investigation, when his semester at Washington State ended in December. He and his father took a pre-planned cross-country road trip back to Pennsylvania. Now, that trip was done in a white Hyundai Elantra, which we told you Moscow police were looking for weeks. They were actually pulled over twice in Indiana, once for speeding and once for tailgating. The Moscow police chief says that the department's only interaction with Kohberger in the small town was a traffic citation for driving without a seatbelt. He now faces charges that include 4 counts of first-degree murder as well as burglary. The Pennsylvania State Police just gave a press conference with details about Kohberger's apprehension.
Those affidavits attached to those search warrants are still under seal, so I can't discuss their contents with you. But one was for the person of Mr. Kohberger, collecting DNA and photographs, that sort of thing. One was for the white Elantra vehicle, which I understand has been seized and is being processed. And one was for the address, the residence itself that he was living in with his family. I was at the scene, and I have to say that Major Paris and Captain Norm Kramer did an outstanding job in coordinating the efforts, not only of the numerous Pennsylvania State police troopers there, but officers from other jurisdictions and disciplines within those jurisdictions to make this a very smooth, highly competent professional operation. It is a quirk, apparently. It's not in the norm of the states I'm familiar with that Idaho does not release their probable cause affidavit in support of their arrest warrant until after their defendant is returned to that state. But having read those documents and the sealed affidavits of probable cause, I definitely believe that one of the main reasons the defendant chose to waive extradition and hurry his return back to Idaho was the need to know what was in those documents. So that's a significant development. Beyond that, looking at the scope of the situation and the ties this defendant has to my county, I would hold our office at the disposal of the Idaho authorities to help facilitate a complete background investigation into the defendant, both activities prior to the murders occurring within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and his activities after the murders in Pennsylvania. So we stand ready to assist with that effort on an ongoing basis.
Some interesting comments there. Well, Steve Gonsalves, who's the father of Kaylee, has been very vocal since the start of this investigation, and he told media outlets that he and the other parents plan to be there when Kohberger appears in an Idaho court. In an interview with NBC News, he said the families still want answers.
Next mission is really to find justice and make sure that we have a closing chapter that meets the expectations of all the families.
Kohberger's family released a statement through a public defender. It says in part, quote, "We care deeply for the 4 families who have lost their precious children. There are no words that can adequately express the sadness we feel, and we pray each day for them. We will continue to let the legal process unfold, and as a family, we will love and support our son and brother." Law and Crime correspondent Sierra Gillespie was in Monroe County, Pennsylvania for Kohberger's extradition hearing. She joins us now. Sierra, it's good to see you. This was a very quick hearing, but an important one.
Yeah, Jesse, this hearing was less than 30 minutes in all. But when Bryan Christopher Kohberger entered the courtroom, it was completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. He came in wearing a red jumpsuit and handcuffs and avoided the gaze of the dozens of reporters that filled the courtroom and instead looked to the front row where 4 of his family members were seated. Kohberger's family, they were drawing a lot of attention to them because they had their hands on each other, kind of hugging each other. And one family member actually was so distraught and crying that a sheriff's deputy brought over a box of Kleenex to give to her to kind of calm herself down. But as far as Kohberger, he told the presiding judge here in Monroe County that he's waiving extradition. He's saying he's doing this without coercion, at his own volition, saying he believes that this is the right choice to head back to Idaho. Something to note here is that Kohberger stood for majority of this hearing. He seemed confident. He didn't quiver at all. His voice was very strong, and he responded to the judge as if he totally understood what she was saying. From here, though, we're expecting Kohberger to be taken back to Idaho within the next 10 days. And after his first initial appearance in Latah County, that's hopefully when a now sealed probable cause affidavit will be unsealed, and we'll learn more information about what led up to Kohberger's arrest and the murder investigation as a whole. Reporting live in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, Sierra Gillespie, Law and Crime Network.
Sierra, thank you. Great reporting as always. Correspondent Anjanette Levy hosted a Q&A session during the lunchtime hour today, getting expert insight from experts to answer your questions about the Idaho murder investigation. And Joseph Scott Morgan, a forensic death investigator, says that the suspect's interest in criminology likely doesn't help him as much as people might think.
We've taken leaps and bounds. We've jumped ahead in the recovery of evidence.
On Law and Crime Daily, we check in with the DNA expert to sift through the places that the suspect could have left a trace in the home where those 4 college students were brutally murdered. But first, why did law enforcement arrest Bryan Kohberger? Well, we explore the requirements needed for probable cause as officials wait for the suspect's extradition back to Idaho. Welcome back, everybody. Probable cause is a phrase we hear a lot when we cover investigations, arrests, and trials. It's part of our Fourth Amendment right when it comes to searches and seizures. Now, we know that police have executed search warrants at Bryan Kohberger's apartment and office at the Washington State campus, and so far, there's been no update on the identification or location of a murder weapon. For now, the probable cause affidavit, which justifies Kohberger's arrest, will stay sealed, but once he's back in Idaho to face trial, the documents could be unsealed. So I want to bring in my co-host and public defender, Brian Buckmeyer. You've dealt a lot with this, and it can get a little difficult because so much of it is really up to interpretation, right?
Jesse, up to interpretation is putting it mildly. You could probably put 10 defense attorneys in a room and get 10 different definitions of probable cause. But no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause. That's what the Fourth Amendment says about probable cause. And courts have tried to define it, but it is no actual universally accepted definition. Instead, courts give this flexible totality of the circumstances approach in defining what a reasonable and prudent person would believe a crime did, is, or will happen. That means what we may find in this case could be very broad in showing why Kohberger is believed to have committed these 4 murders and this burglary charge. But based on what we know so far, I'd expect the arrest warrant and the affidavit attached to be heavily reliant on the tracking of this white Elantra, the surveillance of Kohberger across the country. We would probably learn a lot about the cause of death from the victims and the DNA collected at the scene. DNA found at this scene could be skin cells, but I would bet that it's more likely than not blood, probably of the victims or probably on the victim, or close to where they were murdered, because don't forget, this is a party house. It will be hard for the investigators to differentiate other DNA from that of the suspect, so I think it's going to be close by to the victims.
Well, let's bring in former trial attorney and my co-host Terry Austin as well into the discussion. So Terry, it seems like all of the evidence so far is circumstantial. There's a lot we don't know. Is it too early to say that it's enough to secure a conviction?
Well, you know, it sounds like there is quite a bit of that circumstantial evidence. Brian was just talking about some of that. First of all, we have that car. We have DNA. Those are 2 big pieces of evidence that the jury is going to take very seriously. And now we know they have traced him across the country. Where did he stop? What did he buy? What is that surveillance camera going to tell us across the country? So I think they have a lot of evidence, and I think the jury is going to think about it, even if there is no eyewitness. You know, remember, they're going to get a charge that says circumstantial evidence is just as good as direct evidence. And so if there's enough of that, which I think there will be, and add on to all of that, you know, his credit card receipts, his phone data. There's plenty of evidence here. We've seen convictions on circumstantial evidence, and I think we'll see something here, and the community wants it.
Yeah, of course, and there's a lot that can happen between an affidavit and ultimately a trial, and I know that the police have asked for more information about Kohberger. Coming up on Law and Crime Daily, Kohberger has only 2 choices for a public defender in Idaho. We speak with the attorney for a victim's family about what's next for the suspect. Plus,
that's why they were able to capture this guy.
DNA helped police put a face to the crime scene back in November. We turn to an expert to discuss where it might have been collected and why it took so long to release the information. And welcome back, everybody. Moscow, Idaho officials announced the arrest of suspect Bryan Kohberger on Friday, but behind the scenes, they identified him as a suspect more than a month ago through the use of DNA evidence. Law enforcement said genetic material found at the crime scene matched Kohberger's identity. Genetic genealogy techniques were used to run the material through a public database to try to find potential family member matches. The recovered DNA, combined with other evidence, traced the genetic material back to Kohberger. The victims' families are working with law enforcement to find out how they may have known the suspect, if at all. But with no weapon in custody, what genetic material was actually recovered and from where? Well, we spoke with DNA expert Dr. Monty Miller to explore the possibilities.
They must have found some blood, a glove, a shirt, a hat. I mean, something, you know, where they were confident that it was his DNA. Or maybe they found 3 or 4 things of interest and they ran them all through the database and they picked his out because they found somebody who lived close. I don't know. Police work, you know, when it is something of that magnitude, a lot of people get involved and the DNA gets run real quickly and you know, all ideas are explored almost simultaneously, which makes it nice. And that's why they were able to capture this guy. My guess is they already had a profile that they were looking for. And as soon as they got him, they stuck him into one of those machines and said, yeah, this is our guy, you know, because they don't want to create a media storm when, you know, they don't want to, you know, they want to know in advance. So my guess is they've already done that. But I don't know that to be true.
Terry, it sure seems that authorities are using DNA to capture and convict suspects a lot more now, but does a DNA match guarantee a conviction?
No, it doesn't guarantee anything. I think we will continue to see an increased use of DNA testing, but that's to use the suspects to find them, but I don't think we're going to get all these convictions. Authorities have been using DNA, remember, since the late 1980s. The first use of DNA in court was actually against a guy named Tommy Andrews. He was accused of raping a woman at Knife Point during a burglary. That was in Florida. His DNA was collected from the crime scene, and he was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Now, of course, everybody remembers the O.J. Simpson case. Although there was clear DNA matches in the O.J. Simpson case, the defense argued that the DNA was mishandled, that it was contaminated during collection and processing, and it actually raised enough doubt that the jury ultimately found him not guilty. So DNA testing actually began only with blood samples. Today, as we heard from our expert, DNA testing methods have significantly improved, and DNA can be gathered from blood, skin, anything, hair, bones, saliva, semen. So, you know, it's interesting, Jesse. One thing you have to think about is you can use DNA to convict, but you can also use DNA to prove that somebody's innocent.
That's a good point. Brian, you mentioned earlier that the DNA would likely be blood and not skin cells. Why do you say that? What does that tell us?
Yeah, it's the location that we're talking about. I've defended a lot of cases where they're in party houses or what you call a trap house where like drugs and guns are being used. And we have so many people coming in and out of a location, it's hard for an investigation to pinpoint who they're looking for. But if you have blood, especially in a brutal murder like this, where there's a high likely chance that the weapon might have slipped, nicked the suspect, his blood would have ended up there. Now you're not looking at a bottle with 4 or 5 people touching it and saying, all right, who's the person we're looking for? Now you're looking for blood in an area that's not the victim's, and that's a lot easier to pinpoint and say, all right, this is the person we need to go after. And like Dr. Miller said, they probably already had a profile. He's just someone they had to spot on and get once they got something else to compare to that DNA.
And also you have to imagine that if he didn't have a ready connection, that his DNA being in a place where he'd never been before raises different different difficulties for the defense as well. Now, we told you earlier in the show that correspondent Anjanette Levy hosted a question and answer session during the lunchtime hour, and she got insight from experts to answer your questions about the Idaho murders investigation. So let's hear from Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator, because he told us while the alleged suspect was interested in criminology, that doesn't mean he's going to get away with anything.
There are people that are out there that are conflating the study of criminology with the study of forensic science, and nothing could be further from the truth. Yeah, we cross paths with behaviorists all the time. However, that doesn't make you an expert in crime scene investigation. As a matter of fact, he probably knows very little at all about the process of working a scene and certainly processing the evidence and what we're specifically looking for when you get down into the details. And this case is all about details. And we're going to look in places that he probably thought about, but some places he didn't think about. And
all right, when we come back, there are 4 public defenders in Latah County, Idaho, and 2 of them have recused themselves. So who's left for Kohberger? An attorney for one of the victims' families has some answers. Surprising new information Tuesday about legal representation in Idaho. The man accused of stabbing 4 college students to death says he needs a public defender, but there are only 4 in the county. The state of Idaho doesn't have a public defender system. Instead, 4 attorneys have contracted to help out. One of those is actually the coroner. While she didn't perform the autopsies on the victims, she does have inside knowledge about the reports and other information, so she's recused herself, as did another attorney in that office who works with the police. We learned during a Tuesday afternoon news conference that the chief public defender for another Idaho county was selected to represent Kohberger. Law&Crime spoke with Shannon Gray, the attorney for the attorney for the family of victim Kaylee Gonsalves, and he broke down what's next for Kohberger.
Everyone thinks that I think that he's going to get back here and he's going to automatically be arraigned on the case, and that's just not what's going to happen. His first appearance will probably be getting an attorney. So get either a court-appointed attorney, or if someone if the family hires an attorney, a privately retained attorney, and then that attorney's going to want a couple of days to talk with his client, and then they'll have the preliminary hearing regarding the probable cause for the arrest, and then obviously the Latah County will have to get a grand jury for the indictment, and he can be arraigned on an information prior to the indictment and be held on that. And then, so I mean, there's a lot of moving process things that are going on that aren't going to happen immediately.
Bryan, you're a public defender, and not having court-appointed counsel is a problem anywhere you look, but I think it's really compounded when there's such a small town experiences such a heinous and public crime, right?
Absolutely, Jesse. Justice, no matter how you look at it, will be delayed. Everyone in the United States has a right to counsel, and if you can't afford one, a public defender will be given to you. When, how, and how well funded, though, really depends on where you're arrested. Back in 2015, Latah County, Idaho considered getting a 4th public defender after the state was sued by the Idaho ACLU, and demands were made to make a centralized defender's office. But it doesn't seem like much has changed. That's probably why he's being represented by Ann Taylor, or reportedly so, by Ann Taylor, the chief public defender of Kootenai County. That's just 30 miles east of Spokane, Washington, on the border of Washington, Idaho, and about 100 miles north of Moscow, Idaho. This patchwork of having a public defender from another county stepping in to represent Kohberger will likely help to expedite the case in some way, but having a public defender who lives and works 100 miles away will create its own hurdles in the case, both for representation and expediting the case. But with the public's eye on the case, that may help the process be more efficient, but that's still going to be a long road to hoe.
Bryan makes some great points, Terry, but here's the problem. What happens if something happens to her? What happens if she can't represent him anymore? What if none of the other public defenders can take the case? What happens then?
Well, it's a really good question. What the courts are going to do is continue to look for other public defenders. But if they can't find a public defender in any county, in any surrounding county, what they're going to do is go to their list of private practitioners. And that could be someone who's solo, that could be someone out of a law firm. And remember, these people in law firms are looking for pro bono work. Some of the states require that you have a certain number of hours of pro bono work. So we have that. One thing I will say, if in fact they have to go to these private attorneys, whether it's solo, whether it's a large firm, I think these people are going to hesitate a little bit because they may be criticized for taking the case because it's such a big public case. They could also be criticized because it's such a heinous crime. So if you have to go public or private, it's probably better to go with a public defender who is accustomed to taking the abuse when you have a case like this.
Well, let me, Brian's laughing at that. Brian, I'm going to throw this to you real quick, 30 seconds. What's the first conversation that the attorney has with Bryan Kohberger? Did you do it? I mean, what's the conversation like?
So a lot of public defenders vary on that as to whether or not they want to know if their client had committed the crime. The first thing you want to do is create a relationship with your client. They're the best source of information. Really, you're just going over the affidavit, giving them information and telling them how you're going to represent them, and then tell them you're going to take a lot of abuse because you're a public defender, as Terry said.
Yeah, well, and not only a public defender in such a high-profile case where there are so many people who don't want to hear about Kohberger's defenses or Kohberger's rights, which we have to remind everybody here on a legal show, everybody is entitled to the same rights, and he is innocent until proven guilty. We're at the beginning stages of this investigation in this case, and we'll see where it goes. Brian, Terry, great job as always. Thanks so much. Everyone, thanks so much for joining us here on Law&Crime Daily. We'll see you next time as we discuss justice in America.